One second. So leaving Egypt in the 21st century is a tour that's usually done in a museum, and you can talk about, leaving Egypt without leaving New York. It sounds very catchy, but we're all stuck at home right now. I mean, not so much anymore, but it's like we're not really going anywhere. So the leaving Egypt question is much stronger, much sharper than it usually is, because you can't even go to Egypt on those special cruises that people like doing. Like we're all at home. So I think that this really sharpens the question of how do we leave Egypt? As the Mishnah says, that in every generation a person needs to see themselves as if they left Egypt. How exactly are we supposed to fulfill that if we can't really do anything? So like what exactly is this leaving Egypt? So that's what I'd like to explore. How do we leave Egypt in the 21st century? And what does that mean? And the way to do that, I believe, has to do with knowing Egypt a little bit better, knowing the context in which the story happened, and being able to understand our story in a fresh new way using the archaeology, the art, and the geography, the history, the mythology of ancient Egypt. So this journey is an attempt to cover some of the main points that will give you hopefully a lot of things to think about and to discuss at the Pesach Seder, the Seder table. So let's get started. So the first thing we need to know is Egypt, is to understand the land of Egypt. So the land of Egypt is very unique in that the relationship between Egypt to the Nile is unlike any relationship between a nation to their river that we know of today, like Frankfurt am Main, or talk about the Tom's River. Nobody relates to the river the way the Egyptians did. The Nile for the Egyptians was everything. Egypt was in the center of the universe, and the Nile was a living entity inside it, and they worshipped the Nile. They built temples for the Nile, and they basically immortalized it, and the pharaoh was connected with this very intimately. So that's something we're going to explore. The first thing we need to do is to really turn around the way we look at Egypt. We have to look at it like an Egyptian. So when I say turn around, I actually mean turn upside down. So Egypt being upside down is really how we look at the world. We look at the world as this is upside down because we're used to looking up north, right? We use the compass. We have our compass that points north, which is a navigational trick developed by the Chinese, but that's not really how the Egyptians looked at the world. For the Egyptians, the source of life was the Nile, and the Nile flowed into Egypt from Central Africa, so from the south. And it was also topographically higher up. So the point is that Egyptians looked forward towards where the Nile flowed from, the origin of the Nile, where it flowed into Egypt. And they looked at that as up, that was forward. And so this is the way the Egyptians looked at the world. So this is actually very important to understand mythology later. We're going to get to that. It's a lot of fun. But first of all, in terms of history, Egypt is called the land of the Nile, or as the Greek historian Herodotus calls it, the gift of the Nile. And that's because the Nile is a tremendously powerful source of fertile ground. It brings in heavy minerals, silt, what they called black land, from the monsoons in Africa, which would then flood the banks of the Nile for a few months. And then when they would settle, you'd have all this black land full of rich minerals, and you could use that to grow a surplus of grain and, of course, produce, fruits and vegetables. So this was the power of Egypt. Egypt's economic power comes from the Nile. Their life comes from the Nile. So a lot of metaphors which could relate to the Nile and to the pharaoh and to mythology are intertwined. So we're going to see that soon. So the first thing we need to know is Egypt's history. Egypt historically is called the two lands. There is the Nile Valley and the Nile Delta. The Nile Valley, which we can see as a long, thin, twisted line, is called Upper Egypt because it's higher up and it's looking up. The northern part, which is topographically lower and looks like the Greek-shaped delta, we call it the Nile Delta, was called Lower Egypt. Upper and Lower Egypt were two separate countries which were at war with each other very often. And the first pharaoh, the legendary pharaoh Nemes, was the one who Menes, sorry. The legendary pharaoh Menes is the pharaoh who was able to unite Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is actually how the pharaohs would dress to show this idea. So the first thing we need to know is just, first of all, look at Paro. So there's a nice little picture of Paro that I made standing on top of the river, Paro's dream from the story with Yosef. And this is a little gif of Paro from the internet. But Paro is wearing a Nemes crown. And that's why I got confused between Menes and Nemes. One is a pharaoh, one is a crown. This is a crown of Lower Egypt. But let's talk about crowns, because there are several different ones. So this white crown is the crown of Upper Egypt. So the pharaohs who are depicted with it are originally from Lower Egypt, or perhaps sitting in an administrative center in Lower Egypt. There's different considerations for that, but this is called the crown of Upper Egypt. This red crown is the crown of Lower Egypt. And when the first pharaoh, Menes, was able to unite the both lands, they combined these crowns into the double crown, the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is the crown that the pharaohs would wear to symbolize how they control all of the Nile, all of the land of Egypt, and that entire country is all governed by one person who is a divine person who rules the Nile. And he wears the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt to show this message. So that was our introduction to ancient Egypt. One sec, okay. So that was our introduction to ancient Egypt. That was looking at Egypt again upside down. This is the way the Egyptians looked at the world. We have the Nile Valley, which was called Upper Egypt, and the Nile Delta, which was called Lower Egypt. And each country had a unique crown which represented it. And then they had the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. So that's what we saw so far. Okay. Our next stop is going to be the British Museum. Now, in the British Museum, we're going to have a few different places we're going to visit that have to do with ancient Egypt. But we're going to start with reviewing what we just went over and looking at crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt to appreciate the power of the pharaoh. So let's go. Here we are. All right. Let's just step ahead right here. Okay. So welcome to the Egyptian galleries at the ground floor of the British Museum. And we're looking at many statues of pharaohs that we're going to see from temples throughout Egypt. And this one in front of us is wearing the crown of Lower Egypt. Now we know because it's lower down, it's flat. So it's an easy way to remember that this is a symbol of Lower Egypt. And we're going to see kings of Upper and Lower Egypt as well. So let's take a look at a few more of them. Okay, so now we're looking at a crown of Upper Egypt, right? And it's no longer just cryptic, like we understand something that we're looking at, which is great. We're going to be learning a few things about Egyptian hieroglyphics and culture, right? Here we have some more pharaohs, 3 of them, and they're wearing the crown of Lower Egypt, one of the crowns of Lower Egypt. And finally, here is a king, this is Amenhotep III, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. So we see that there are several different ways to represent the king of Egypt, and it has to do with their crown. The crowns represent different parts of Egypt and the unification of Egypt, which is what started the dynastic period of Egypt. In other words, the first pharaoh, the first king of Egypt, is the uniter of both lands. All right, now I'm going to jump back for a moment. Hang on. There we go. All right. Now let's put what we learned into action. We're looking at a fragment of a much bigger picture from a palace of Ramses the Great. You can see the feet of Ramses on his throne on the left, and up close, let's try to really get our noses up close into this wall carving. So this is a list of kings of Egypt, all of the kings of Egypt leading up to Ramses the Great. So we're talking about over 1,000 years of pharaohs, and it was very important for them to record their names. Now, how would they write the name of the pharaoh? We know now that it was the hieroglyphics contained within a circular shape, which the French called cartouche, and we just call it a cartouche, but it means cartridge in English because it's filled with things. And what's neat about it is that it tells you the origin of the different pharaohs based on Upper or Lower Egypt. So look carefully. There's a line dividing the different kings of the different dynasties, but look on top. From the top left, moving to the right. Here is a crouching king of Upper Egypt. Here's a king of Lower Egypt, because you see the crown. Upper and lower, upper and lower. If we move down the register, lower, 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 lots of kings of Lower Egypt, and they switch around. So what's important is that the Egyptians were very conscious of where the pharaohs came from, where they were born, and the fact that they then become the unifier of Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is part of their name, part of their titles. The pharaohs had many titles, and one of them was the ruler of both lands. And that's a very important aspect of their kingship. All right. Next up, we're going to see a few fun things along the way. So before we move on to talk more about pharaohs, I want to take you to what's inside the pyramids and the tombs. See, there's actually a plaque here, Egypt in the age of the pyramids. So what exactly is inside if you go into the pyramid? The centerpiece of any burial chamber, as the pyramid is a glorified royal burial chamber for the pharaoh, but they all follow the same pattern. There is this door structure, which would be where you would come before it and lay libations and gifts before this door, and it was called a false door. And the reason it's called a false door is because running into it, you're just going to get a bump in your head, but you're not going to manage to make through. It's not intended for people to pass through. Rather, it's meant for spirits to pass through. And this actually has navigational advantages if you understand how this works. So I'm going to give you a little trick that's going to help you if you're stuck in a tomb or in a pyramid, in a burial cave in Egypt, and you want to pray towards Jerusalem. This is going to be a trick that will help you to know what direction to pray without a compass when you're stuck in Egypt. So Egyptians had many different gods, mythology, right? And one of them is the sun god, a very important one, the sun god Ra or Re. And Ra, they looked at him as rising in the east on his boat, the sun boat, and setting in the west, and then delving down into the underworld, the world of the dead, the Duat, and making his travels there. And then the next day emerging and rising again in the east and setting in the west. The important thing here is that the sun's transition into the world of the dead happens in the west. And so the false door as the point of contact between the world of the living and the world of the dead, where you come to pray to the dead, is in the west. So if you're stuck in the pyramids and it's time to pray, to pray mincha or something, make sure that the false door is on your left. So you're looking up towards Jerusalem. Let's go visit some important pharaohs. Okay, so first of all, this is a very important pharaoh. In the discussion about where to place the Exodus in Egyptian history, there are several opinions out there. We don't really have an absolute answer, but one of the contenders, according to some, is the father of this pharaoh. In other words, this is the pharaoh we're already in the desert or making our way into the land of Israel. So this is Amenhotep III. He is the grandfather of the very famous King Tut. So we know him. We can anchor him in the 18th dynasty. The other option is Ramses the Great, who is at the end of this hall. We're going to get to him soon. But before we do, I don't want to walk through this fist. I want to show you the fist. This is a massive fist, which is part of this incredibly large statue from Karnak, the statue of Amenhotep. And it shows you his outstretched arm, showing his power, his control. And what's beautiful about this is that we ourselves use that term in the Torah, biyad chazaka bizroa netuyah, with an outstretched arm. God is going to let us out of Egypt. And when you're in Egypt, the expression outstretched arm is something that people see in the many statues of Paro, which are there throughout the land. So it's speaking Egyptian lingo in a way that Egyptians can understand and we can appreciate and we can understand. It's called appropriating. We're taking their language and using it against them. So Hashem is saying, God's saying, I will show you an outstretched arm, right? As opposed to Paro's outstretched arm. All right, right in front of us, you can see the little rollover text that says bust of Ramses. We're going to go there in just a moment. We are right in between the two pharaohs, the two periods in which perhaps the Exodus took place. That's the discussion. And right in between them is the famous Rosetta Stone. So the Rosetta Stone, I want to get a good view of it. The Rosetta Stone is very important to us because it's the key to Egyptian hieroglyphics, as the plaque here on the side also tells us, the key to Egyptian hieroglyphics. And this actually has to do with the name of Pharaoh. So I'd like to jump in here and just to show you a little bit of how Champollion, I'm sure you're familiar with the story. He's a French Egyptologist. This was found by Napoleon's soldier in Egypt, and he realized that on the hieroglyphics line on the top is this circle filled with hieroglyphics, which we now call a cartouche. And he noticed that it repeats itself. It's the same images, and there's a description of it here on the side, but it's the name Ptolemaeus, or King Ptolemy V. And he said, look, I don't know how to read the hieroglyphics, and below here is hieratic script, which is like a handwritten form of Egyptian, but they know how to read the Greek here below. Now, he took a guess that that cartouche is a reference to the name of the king, which shows up here several times, and his guess was right. And he basically aligned them up and broke up the hieroglyphics to their phonetic sound, and he was able to therefore extract from it the sound that stands behind the pictograph. And so, very long story short, it's the name of the king which helped decipher ancient hieroglyphics. Demotic, not hieratic. Okay. All right. Let's go to Ramses the Great. You click on something, it'll pop up. Nice. That's really nice about the British Museum. They have a lot of things you can click on and read up. So Ramses the Great, this is one of the greatest pharaohs, if not the greatest pharaoh of all of ancient Egypt. He ruled for 67 years, and he was about not 2 meters, about 1.90 meters. He was very tall, about over 6 feet. And the reason we know that is because we found this mummy. It's in Cairo. So it's not only the Cairo Geniza that's important. We also have, the pharaoh. Now notice that he's wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, except the upper part is fragmented. It's broken, but it's showing you he was a powerful pharaoh. All right, let's walk through this wall as spirits can do. And now we have the sheep. We have the ram. And this is, of course, related to Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach, as we know, was a kind of miracle because the Egyptians basically worshipped the ram god. The ram god is actually Amun-Ra. It was the state god of Karnak, and the city is called No Amun. It has to do with Amun, right? And the god Amun was represented by the ram, and there's an entire alleyway, a whole pathway of these ram head sphinxes in Karnak in honor of the god Amun-Ra. So it wasn't just a small Egyptian deity. He's a very, very big deal. He's like the sun god, something like that. He's like the hidden aspect, the nameless one, whatever, but it represented by the ram. So this is a really big deal, and we're looking at it right here. So that's the first thing I want to show you. And the second one is that we're surrounded by coffins, which were used for putting in the mummies. So this is a great way to jump in and to talk about mummies. But before we talk about, I'm going to get to mummies. Mummies is where we're going to talk about mythology and all kinds of cool stuff. But I think that before we do that, I think it will be really helpful to talk about something that's immediately related to Pesach. We just did B'dikat Chametz. It's an interesting year because we can still eat Chametz on Shabbat because of the whole thing. But Chametz and Matzah. Okay, so to talk about Chametz and Matzah, I'm going to take us actually to Chicago. So the Oriental Institute. Some of you have been on this, been here with me as well. But this is the Egyptian galleries. We haven't been to the Egyptian galleries of ancient Egypt, of the Oriental Institute. So we're looking at a lot of different things here. I'm going to focus on these miniature models. So these miniature models, let's look at them up close and see what is going on. These are miniature models made of clay. We'll see some that are made of wood, and I'm going to show you high resolution images from the Metropolitan Museum where they have more of these miniature models. But what are these miniature models? What are they? The Egyptians buried with their dead all sorts of personal belongings because they wanted the deceased to continue to use them in death, but they also tried to enable them to do what they did in life. And the way to do that is to make a magical imitation of what they did in life. So there's kids wrestling here. So maybe this guy was a wrestling coach. There's a servant here who's slaughtering a cow. There's a couple standing here that would probably represent the couple themselves. But there's all kinds of things going on. There's women using grindstones. There's a kid here, a lot of kids with instruments, with string instruments. And there's some little kid here who's cooking something. I don't know. So that's the kind of thing you'd expect to see in an Egyptian tomb. All kinds of miniature representations of what they did in life, which would magically enable the deceased to do them in death forever. Here's another thing they would bury with them. These are called ushabtis. Hold on. We can see more of them at the British Museum, a little better lighting. But these are little votive statues, which they would have all kinds of writing on them, and they'd bring them to the deceased and make prayers and lay them below at their feet. We found boxes full of them from the many times people came to visit. So this is like putting a note in the kotel, lehavdil, right? Not the same thing, but it's that idea, okay, of praying and leaving something there. Now, these are miniature models made of wood and paint. Some of them have garments made of linens, which survived for 4,000 years, which is incredible, by the way. The reason, the way they survived is simply because of the special, unique, dry and hot climate of ancient Egypt. So because it's so dry, there's no humidity, which will create mold and eat away at the wood. They were able to preserve these in caves. So it's incredible. They have all these little models of people doing different things. So you see there's a ship in the background. They're floating their ships, which also represented the soul floating across the world into the world of the undead. So they have that in the Nile and the boats flowing as a metaphor as well. But the Egyptians were very adept at flowing up and down the Nile. Okay. The next part has to do with preparation of food. To show you a better picture of this, I'm going to go back to our slide. And we're going to talk about chametz and matzah using these exhibits that are at the Met. Okay. So at the Metropolitan Museum, we have a few of these boxes from an old kingdom period tomb. We're talking about the time of the Great Pyramids of Giza. It's very old, 4,000 years. We're looking at an image of a granary from an estate owner. Now, the granary has on the right-hand side servants pouring grain into storage houses. Think of the story of Yosef gathering and storing grain, right? The Egyptians would store their grain. But the people in the left room, which are enlarged on these two individual characters, are scribes. What are scribes doing in a granary? Well, they are, of course, recording the grain, because the grain in Egypt was how they measured their GDP. The grain in Egypt is how the Egyptians measured their wealth. And they actually had nilometers, which would gauge how much produce you can make based on the level of the Nile that year. And that's how they would come and demand advance payments for taxes. So this is a very well thought out system, but the grain is the buying power of Egypt. Grain is Egypt's economic power. Grain is edible currency. It's the power of Egypt to produce an incredible amount of grain, which made other empires depend on them for shipments of grain when they needed bread. So Egypt is a provider, and it's what makes them powerful. So this is their currency. Now, the next cool thing is what these people are doing in another one of these miniature model boxes. So from right to left, let's see what's going on here. We have a servant standing next to an oven, waiting for the oven to heat up, perhaps. In the center, we have somebody who is kneading dough, and they even put the flour on his hands, which is really neat. and the women on the left are using grindstones. As you can imagine, the grinding motion of a stone against a stone, collecting the flour, right? This is where the expression, the daily grind, comes from. The daily grind is something that you do every single day, and you make fresh bread. Now, here's the little factoid which will blow your mind, which relates to Pesach. Egypt is responsible for inventing bread. Egypt were the inventors of bread. And this is because of Egypt's unique conditions, and this is related to Egypt's mentality and connection to Paro. And I'm going to claim that this is part of their slave mentality. And that's a very important point. So let's talk about the conditions first. Nomadic people, like our forefathers, our mothers, our ancestors, were nomads. They had herds, and they traveled along the hill of Israel in order to follow the rainfall for grazing land. That's what people do. They're when they're nomads. They travel and follow where the rain is, right? Now, how do you make bread when you're a nomad? You're definitely not carrying around an oven. It's impractical. You have a tabun. You make pita. You make matzah. Matzah is nomadic bread. But Egypt was not going anywhere. Egypt sits there and settles along the Nile, and the Nile is a given. It comes there all the time. And so you're settled. You're not going anywhere. You can afford to play around and experiment. Let's see what happens to this dough. Let's wait for the oven to heat. You take your time. In contrast with matzah, which is 18 minutes and we got to move and on the double and run and chipazon and move. When we are given the first mitzvah of the first Pesach, it's bechipazon. We need to do it quickly. We need to look like we're nomads. We're in a hurry. We're rushing to be on the move. And that is to distance ourselves from the food of Egypt, the bread of Egypt. So I want to talk about slave mentality here because it's an incredibly important idea. So Egypt invented bread. And in the next slide, Egypt also prepared beer, which is another thing you do with grain. Bread and beer, chametz and seor, machmetzet, are basically the foods which we're supposed to refrain from on Pesach. Egypt food, bad. Nomad food, good. And why is that? I'd like to claim is that because the pharaohs, which we're going to talk about that in just a moment, were believed to be the rulers of Egypt to the point of the Nile is successful because of the pharaohs. So when you want to measure your own income, your own grain, who takes all the credit for it, if not Paro? Paro takes the credit for all of your success, and you owe your life to him. It's an ingrained and reinforced slave mentality where the idea of individual freedom didn't exist in ancient Egypt, as historians say. It's an idea which was novel, and us breaking away from that is an incredibly powerful thing. It's what formed our identity as a people, being able to escape a land which forces you to think in terms of slave mentality. We are all servants to Paro. Whatever he says, we do. Throw babies in the Nile, we'll throw babies in the Nile. No questions asked, right? That's how it is in ancient Egypt, okay? So that was about chametz and matzah, really taking us into the archaeology, the history. It helps us appreciate chametz and matzah from an intuitive, experiential way of dealing with it from the story of Egypt, okay? Our next story is going to do with mythology, and for that, we're going to go back into the museum, but we're going to go back to London, to the British Museum, and we've jumped up to the 3rd floor. All right. So welcome to the Hall of the Dead. This is a room full of mummies, actual real mummies. We're going to look at them a little bit. Okay. So first of all, what do they look like on the outside? And then we're going to see what they look like on the inside. All right. It's some fun stuff. All right. So these are more cheaper burial caskets. Not everyone was able to afford a fancy pyramid or tomb or a stone coffin. This was a wooden coffin, but you see that the mummy is wrapped in linens, right? Which were unwrapped, and inside them is these are what the mummies looked like. They opened them up. We don't do that anymore. Now we put them in MRIs. We scan them, 3D imaging. It's high quality stuff. You can do X-rays, but they used to open them up. And this is what a mummy looks like when it's opened up. It's a lovely sight to not see. And there's lots of plaques about the mummification, preservation of the body, using salt to dry up the skin, collecting the organs and putting them in jars. And then there's mourning ceremonies and boats sailing in the Nile, all that good stuff. All right. Let's look at these ones over here. So these are golden coffins, which means that whoever had them made was very wealthy, had a nice endowment. And there's all these little trinkets that were buried with them. So those ushabti prayer statuettes that we saw. Now, going all the way to the creepy side, I'm going to stay here just for a few seconds. Well, here's the skeletons. So, and there's a lot to talk about how they opened them up, and DNA studies and genetic studies. You can tell about, you know, how they died sometimes from genetic diseases that came from intermarriage or died in battle. There's a lot of cool things that you can find out. All right. I'd like to talk about the mythology and the magic which has to do with the underworld, with mummification. So let's look around. Okay, first of all, in order to survive, for the spirit to survive and live forever, the Egyptians wanted to preserve the body and protect it and maintain it. And for that purpose, they made all these tiny little amulets and trinkets and little beetle shapes and rings and necklaces, which they would bury on the dead with charms to protect them in the afterlife. This is the first thing they would do. But they would also write magical texts which would decorate the tomb walls, and later on were written on papyrus. So when they were written on the pyramid walls, they were called pyramid texts, but they gradually became written on papyrus. I mean, not everyone has a pyramid, right? So let's look up close. That's not what I meant by up close. It's a little too close. There we go. See, when we are visiting the room of mummies, we can act like spirits and walk through walls. That's what's really fun about this. So these are all papyri, the Egyptian reed-based paper, and there's painted images on it of all kinds of different burial-related texts that are intended to protect the body. And this one is called the Book of the Dead, which is what we call it. That's not what they called it. The Book of the Dead is a lens into Egyptian mythology, but also to appreciate what was going on with the 10 Makot, with the 10 plagues. What was Hashem trying to achieve? And why does Paro need to endure this? Why do we even need to endure this for another extra year in Egypt? So this is the important idea. I'm going to say this is an overview, okay? Because I can't get into all the details. I'm going to cover some of the Makot. So this is a Book of the Dead. We can open it up in high definition. It's called the Book of the Dead of Hunefer. That's the name of this man with a short little beard and the white gowns. You see him all over. So this is basically a guide for the deceased, telling him how to navigate the treacherous path to get into the afterlife. You have to memorize the names of all of these gods and pray and praise them and tell them, testify that you haven't sinned, all that good stuff. And finally, there's what's called the Judgment of Osiris, who is the ruler of the underworld of the Duat. And that's this lovely character wrapped up like a mummy with green skin. And if you've seen a Beetlejuice, you know that means he's dead, right? So he has green skin. He's sitting there and he's presiding over the ceremony of the weighing of the heart. Weighing the heart of the deceased against on a scale of justice, which will say whether or not he can continue into the Duat and live forever, or will he be, or is his heart be gobbled up by this horrible monster that's sitting under the scale. So this is the Book of the Dead. Now I'd like to parse that into pieces so that we can really appreciate what's going on here and get a glimpse into Egyptian society and into Paro. And to do that, I'm going to take you back to our slide to introduce some of the characters. All right, so I'm going to run through some of these. So first of all, Osiris, who's the lord of the underworld. His son Horus we'll talk about later. The scale of justice, this weighing of the heart, is actually weighing the heart against Ma'at. Ma'at is both a goddess and a concept which is cosmic order and balance, represented by that ostrich feather which she's wearing in her hair. That ostrich feather, balanced on its tip, represents cosmic order. And what we need to know about Paro is that Paro is believed to provide Ma'at. Paro's role in the universe is to maintain Ma'at, to maintain cosmic order and balance. And that's going to be very important in just a few moments. But the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of judgment, of justice, and that's how you know the person is righteous. We have the god of Egypt who is responsible for the weighing of the heart. He is a jackal, a wild dog called Anubis, and he's responsible for the transition from life to death. That's what's important about him. He's a dark, scary character. And finally, we have Amut the devourer, who's the monster who eats up the heart of the deceased if he doesn't make it through. Now that we've seen this introduction, let's go into another example of the Book of the Dead, the Judgment of Osiris. Here is Anubis weighing the heart against Ma'at, who's seen as a little figurine on the right-hand side of the scale, and there's the heart on the left side. Now, the weighing of the heart, if your heart is too heavy, then you are considered wicked and your heart will be eaten up. You don't make it into the afterlife. Now, here's a fun little factoid. We spoke about appropriating language. We take the language of ancient Egypt, which is heavy heart equals bad, and we see that throughout the story. Hashem tells Moshe, I'm making Paro's heart heavy. Paro's heart is heavy. His heart has been heavy again and again. That expression, heaviness of heart, is very common in Egyptian mythology. It's understandable to mean evil. That's the first thing. Now, before we talk about Paro, I want to talk about the purpose of the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues, as mentioned in the Torah, are there to make an example of all of the gods of Egypt and to basically show that they don't have any, they're not real. They don't have any reality. And to prove this point, we have to go through 10 different steps. These 10 steps, I like to call them, just like we have the 12-step therapy for addiction, right? I call it the 10-step therapy from Egyptian mentality, 10-step therapy. Each one of those steps corresponds to a different aspect that everyone believed, including Pharaoh, that the Pharaoh controls. So you start with the Nile, Dam Tzfardea, blood and frogs. You move up to small animals in the land. You move up to disease, skin disease, more complex things. Then you move up to the heavens, to the skies, night and day, and finally to life and death itself. And in the 10th plague, we have a curious connection to the god who relates to life and death, of course, and that is Anubis, the god of the dead, the Lord of the dead. So this is a beautiful fan art that I found on the internet. I just Googled the weighing of the heart. But you see here Anubis holding a heart on one side and holding the feather of Ma'at on the other. Now, what's beautiful is that, the text got a little bit stretched out. What's beautiful here is that in the death of the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, Makat Bechorot, we hear that lechol bnei Yisrael lo yecheratz kelev leshono lemeish ve'adisha leman yid'u ki Hashem hamafle ben Mitzrayim uben Yisrael. In other words, during the plague of the death of all of the Bechorot, not a single dog will make a sound. And that way everyone will know that God differentiates between Egypt and Israel, between who lives and who dies. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Dogs are going to be quiet, and therefore we're going to know that God controls life and death. Unless we are dealing with the Egyptian mentality and mythology and worldview that Anubis is responsible for life and death. And if Anubis is responsible for life and death, you're going to hear it resounding in the world. You're going to hear dogs, which is Anubis, barking and howling. And yet they are supernaturally quiet or eerily quiet. You're hearing crickets. It's unusual, and that drives the point home. So this is one of several details. We can obviously expand more, but I want to talk about Paro because we're about to go to the temples and pyramids. We need to understand Paro a little bit better. So here's the weighing of the heart. You see Anubis and the scale and the feather on the right and the heart in a jar on the left, and the monster in the background in the right is waiting to eat the heart if the person doesn't make it. All of that we have. Paro starts off believing that he controls the cosmos, which is Egypt is the center of the cosmos, and he controls the world, and he is responsible for Ma'at, for cosmic order and balance. This therapy, 10-step therapy session is intended to show Paro as well that he doesn't control the world, to free him of that slave mentality, which he believes that he's locked into, and everyone is locked into this mentality. we have an incredible development that happens right where Vaira and Bo, the two parashot, are cut off. We have, after the plague of hailstorms of Barad, Paro comes to Moshe and Aaron and he says, Chatati hapam, I have sinned. Hashem hatzadik ve'ani ve'ami hareshaim. God is righteous and me and my people are wicked. Whoa. How did he manage to make such progress? Isn't he the rightful controller of the universe, the rightful person to subjugate us, the Hebrews? Who are you to tell me to let them go? What, you're going to threaten me with bigger weapons? Ha! On principle, I will refuse to let them go, because you're not going to force me to do what I need to do in order to maintain the universe, to maintain order, to control Egypt. I can't let them go. He suddenly recognizes he is evil. That's part of the development of the gradual 10-step therapy session of the 10 Makot. That's what we are intending to achieve, to show Egypt that Paro does not control them, and he does not control the world, and they do not need to be controlled by him either, and we can become free people ourselves by recognizing that we didn't really have an oppressor. He was a joke. He's made a mockery of, and you make fun of Paro. Right, the famous story, Paro be-pijama, we sing in Israel, Paro's in pajamas in the middle of the night. We make a joke out of Paro to say, like, ha, we can leave whenever we want, right? So we become free in our minds. Okay, that was Paro. Now, in the last topic we're going to talk about has to do with the power of Paro himself, and we're going to go to the temple of Abu Simbel in Egypt and then to the pyramids. So the temple of Abu Simbel is a very, very fascinating story. It also relates to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There's what's called the Temple of Dendur, which relates to the same story. So what's the story? You see here Aswan on the top, on the right here. This is what's called the Aswan High Dam, which was built by Nasser in the 1960s, more or less during the time of the Six-Day War. And when it was being built, all of the monuments that were lower of it, or further up actually, in terms of Upper Egypt, were flooded and damaged. And UNESCO had an initiative to try to save some of these monuments. One of them was the Temple of Dendur, which was gifted to the United States for helping. One of them is the Temple of Ramses the Great in Abu Simbel, which was in an incredible engineering operation by the Egyptian government, and UNESCO was actually lifted from the lower part of the mountain and brought up to the top of the mountain. This entire incredibly large monument was cut into 16,000 pieces and lifted up and rebuilt facing the same direction, looking at the exact same thing. This is a very important monument. And first of all, let's just examine what we see. So we see 4 statues of pharaohs who are probably different ones from the dynasty. It's the father, the grandfather, whoever. But you see that they're wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, which shows you control. There is the god Ra, the sun god, and this is called the Temple of the Sun. Abu Simbel is the Temple of the Sun. And there's the wife and daughters of the pharaoh beneath him. And I want to take you to something really neat, hold on, which is a 3D virtual tour of the temple. We're just going to spend a few minutes here, but it's really cool. I'm happy to send you the link later. Okay, I'm going to turn off the music just because it's distracting. All right. And this is everything you can see going inside it. It's really great. And you can read information about it. Okay. So first of all, being slaves in Egypt was not pretty. These slaves are being shown underneath the feet of Paro, handcuffed and tied around the neck, really driving the point home of Paro is on top of everyone. I mean, look how massive he is. This is all royal propaganda. But he's sending the message that he is the sole ruler of Egypt. He is above all, and these are all beneath him. Okay. We can move further inside, and there would be a lot to see. I'm happy, of course, to send you the link later or just send me a message. But I want you to see what is at the end of this tomb. Let's jump in. Look, there's beautiful carvings and images, stories about Ramses this, Ramses that, showing how great he was, yada, yada. All right. Now, as the sun would rise in the east behind us, it would shine and light up the face of these gods of Egypt. The second one from the right is Ramses the Great, who's wearing the blue battle crown. So this entire monument has to do with victory in battle. To his right and left are other gods of Egypt. There's Ra, there's Amun, and then there is Ptah to the left. But either way, the point is that he is surrounded by these gods. It's as if he gets their approval. And when the sun shines on his face, everybody knows he's the beloved of Ra, of the sun god. So this is a very important propaganda move to show how important Paro is. All right. So this has to do with Paro. Now, I want to take you to the pyramids, to the Great Pyramids of Giza. That's where we're going to end. We're going to talk about the pyramids. But before we talk about the pyramids, hang on, I want to introduce one last detail about Paro, and that has to do with mythology. So to do that, I'm taking you to the temple of Horus in Edfu. Here we go. So this is a temple. You see everyone taking pictures, they're having a lot of fun. But up front by the entrance of the temple is this falcon wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Y'all see him? Yeah. Now this falcon is the god Horus. He's the sky god. He's a vulture, the fastest bird in Egypt. And there are some who say that, by the way, Kanfei Nesharim are actually probably not an eagle. It might be a vulture or a hawk. So this is actually a hawk. Sorry, not a vulture. He's a hawk. So God takes us out of Egypt on the wings of eagles. It's very possible that it's actually a hawk. I don't think they had eagles in Egypt. So, but that's a nice conversation. Okay. So who was Horus and what does it have to do with Paro? This is going to be our final step. So who is Horus? So Horus is called Horus the Avenger. Horus is the son of Isis and Osiris, who was murdered by his uncle, and he ends up spending time in the underworld with his father, who becomes, Osiris, the god of the underworld, the guy right behind him. And he goes back up to the world of the living, confronts his uncle, and takes revenge and controls Egypt. And he then becomes the ruler of not only the underworld, but also the world above. Notice his crown. He's wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. And this is where we have the crossover between Paro and mythology. Paro in life is a human being, but in death becomes Horus. Paro is the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. He's called the ruler of both lands, as we introduced. And the falcon god, Horus, is the god of upper and lower worlds. So there's this combination of upper and lower of two lands. And so Horus is Paro and Paro is Horus. And actually, before the ruler of Egypt was ever called Paro, they were called Horus. The first pharaohs were called Horus, and their image was described not in the cartouche like we saw in the Rosetta Stone, but rather with an image of Horus. That's how you referred to the pharaoh, the uniter of both worlds, the uniter of both lands. And so this is the picture of the statue we just saw in Edfu. This shows you Horus. So I'd like to end up with a story which I call the story of Horus and Henry Kissinger. And that takes us back to the 1960s when the Aswan Dam was built, before the Six-Day War. Okay, let's go into the pyramids to share the story, or right next to the pyramids, that is. The pyramids of Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. You can go visit them without leaving your desktop. Of course, it's not the same thing, but these are the pyramids. All right, try to get a better view. Okay, so the story goes like this. I'm going to wrap up with this story. Henry Kissinger, who was the American Secretary of State, he had a Jewish wife and a Jewish child, and he wanted his kid to learn a little bit more about Judaism, what we would call a birthright trip. So he sent him to Israel, and Jerusalem at that time wasn't so accessible. So he traveled with an archaeologist from the Hebrew University called Meir Bendov, who excavated in Jerusalem after the Six-Day War. But before that, he was excavating all the Herodian stuff, Masada, etc. So this young teenager, very cynical, is challenging Meir Bendov, and he says, I don't get it. You keep on talking about this Herod, this king of the Jews, king of the Hebrews, king of the Jews, king of the Jews, who built this temple, like big deal. The pharaohs also built massive pyramids. Like, what's the difference between them? What makes the king of the Jews so special? we're going to put aside the fact that Herod was a bit of a megalomaniac. We're going to talk about the king of the Jews, okay? Here's what Meir Bendov said to him. He said, the difference between the pharaohs and the king of the Jews is that the king of the Jews the pharaohs use the resources of the entire country to build a pyramid for one person, for Pharaoh, to protect him in the afterlife. The king of Israel, the king of the Jews, spends the resources of the country to build a beautiful temple in Jerusalem so that everyone can come and pray to the God of Israel in Jerusalem. That's the difference. Later that day, that story apparently made an impact because Henry Kissinger gave Meir Bendov a phone call and he said, I want to thank you for what you said to my son. I think he's going to stay interested in Judaism for another 5 years because of that. So that's the story as it goes. It's a sad twist the way I said it that way, but it's still, that's the story. And the idea is that Egypt is all about this one person, Paro, who's literally and metaphorically at the top of the pyramid, at the top of society. And everyone is locked into this propaganda-driven idea that Paro controls all of their lives and they are all servants to him. And our identity was formed by confronting that, by struggling with that, and emerging strong and leaving Egypt. So hopefully what we've been able to take from here is to appreciate that understanding Egypt in its context, historically, geographically, archaeologically, helps us appreciate that struggle of leaving Egypt, leaving a kingdom which was entirely devoted to one person, and showing us how we can be free of that and free people. So that's the story. I'm gonna pause it here, pause the recording.